Most women my age, when they speak of the birth of their first child, do so with a wistful smile, a gentle tremor in their voice that recalls a moment of profound, world-altering joy. Their memories are a vibrant tapestry of first cries, of tiny fingers wrapping around their own, of a love so fierce it felt like it could hold back the tide. For me, that memory is a cold, empty space. It's a silence where a cry should have been, a stillness where life should have pulsed. It's a secret I have carried since I was 16 years old, a truth buried so deep in the soil of my past that even the relentless ocean has never managed to wash it ashore. My name is Betty, and at 82 years of age, the weight of that silence has not lessened, not by a single ounce. Please subscribe to this channel, hit the notification bell, and leave a like on this video. And tell me in the comments, where are you listening from today? My story doesn't begin with that silence, but it has always been hurtling towards it. It begins, as so many stories do, with the sea. Here in Port Blossom, Maine, the sea is not just a backdrop. It's a character in everyone's life. It dictates the economy, perfumes the air with salt and brine, and composes the soundtrack of our days with the cry of gulls and the mournful groan of the foghorn on misty mornings. In the late 50s, when I was a girl on the cusp of womanhood, my world was even smaller than this town. It was the four walls of my father's diner, the Salty Spoon, a cozy haven of warmth and the smell of fresh coffee and frying bacon, perched right on the edge of the main dock. My mother had passed when I was just a child, leaving my father and me to navigate the world as a quiet, two-person crew. He was a man carved from the same granite as our coastline, stern, weathered, and not given to easy words or grand emotions. His love wasn't found in hugs or praise. It was in the extra slice of pie he'd leave for me at the end of a long shift, in the way he'd silently mend the strap of my school satchel without me having to ask, in the fierce, protective glint I'd sometimes catch in his expression when a rowdy fisherman got too familiar. He taught me everything he knew, not through lessons, but through labor. I learned to calculate change in my head before I mastered algebra in school. I could tell by the sound of the sizzle on the griddle if the eggs were ready, and I knew the coffee order of every regular before they'd even shaken the rain from their coats. Our life was a rhythm, steady and predictable as the tides. We woke before the sun, my father firing up the grill while I wiped down the counters and filled the salt and pepper shakers. The morning rush was a blur of fishermen grabbing coffee and breakfast sandwiches before heading out. The midday lull brought in the town, gossips, and shopkeepers. The evenings were for families and the sailors whose ships were in port. Then we'd clean, lock up, walk the short distance to our little house overlooking the harbor, and do it all again the next day. I never imagined another life. I was my father's daughter, the girl from the Salty Spoon. I assumed I'd marry a local boy, maybe a lobsterman or a carpenter, and raise my own children in the familiar scent of salt and fried clams. I didn't dream of escape because I didn't know I was in a place that needed escaping from. It was simply life, solid and real. My father had one recurring piece of wisdom, usually delivered while staring out the diner window at the ships in the harbor. "Betty," he'd say, his voice a low rumble. "The ocean gives, and the ocean takes. It brings the fish that feed us, and the trade that keeps this town alive. But it also brings strangers, men with no roots, who live by the currents. Be wary of a man whose only home is the horizon. His promises are written on water." I would nod, half listening, the words as familiar and ignorable as the sound of the bell above the door. I didn't understand the deep, painful truth they held until the day Joe walked in. It was a Tuesday in early summer, one of those perfect Maine days when the sky is a brilliant, cloudless blue and the sea is a sheet of glittering diamonds. The bell above the door chimed, and he entered, bringing with him a sense of a world far beyond Port Blossom. He wasn't a fisherman, his hands were clean, and he lacked the weary slouch of men who fight the sea for a living. He wore the crisp uniform of a naval officer, and he moved with an easy confidence that seemed to quiet the clatter of the diner. "Morning," he said, his voice smooth and warm, a stark contrast to the rough, clipped speech of the local men. He took a seat at the counter, and when I walked over, he offered a smile that seemed to change the very atmosphere of the room. It wasn't just a smile, it was an event. "Coffee, please. Black." Ordinarily, I was all business, efficient and a little distant. But for the first time in my life, I felt a strange flutter in my chest. My hands, which could effortlessly flip a dozen pancakes, suddenly felt clumsy as I poured his coffee. "Your ship in for long?" I asked, my voice sounding unnaturally high to my own ears. "2 weeks. Engine repairs," he replied, taking a sip of the coffee and nodding in appreciation. "I'm Joe." "Betty," I managed. He didn't just drink his coffee and leave. He lingered. He asked me about Port Blossom, about my life, about the diner. He didn't talk down to me like some of the older men did, or flirt awkwardly like the boys my age. He spoke to me as if I were the most interesting person he'd ever met. He told me about his life in the Navy, about the ports he'd seen, San Diego, Pearl Harbor, even distant places in the Mediterranean. He painted pictures with his words, and I, a girl who had never been farther than Augusta, felt myself being transported. For the first time, the world outside the Salty Spoon seemed not just a vague concept, but a real, vibrant place I wanted to see. When my father emerged from the kitchen, wiping his hands on his apron, his eyes immediately fell on Joe, then on me. I saw that familiar, protective glint, but this time it was harder, sharper. Joe, sensing the shift, finished his coffee, paid his bill with a crisp $1, and left a generous tip. "I'll be back tomorrow, Betty," he said, his gaze holding mine for a moment longer than necessary. And he was. He came back every single day. Sometimes for breakfast, sometimes for a late lunch, sometimes just for a cup of coffee in the quiet of the afternoon. Each visit was a chapter in a story I didn't want to end. He learned my routine, knew when my father would be busy in the back, and used those moments to talk to me. We learned about each other in stolen minutes over the worn Formica countertop. I learned he'd grown up in a landlocked state and had joined the Navy to see the world. He learned that I dreamed of one day having a small garden, that I read every book I could get my hands on from the town library, and that I secretly hated the smell of fried fish. My father's disapproval grew with each visit. It was a silent, heavy presence in the diner. He'd slam plates a little harder, his goodbye to Joe clipped and cold. One evening, after we'd locked up, he finally spoke his mind. "He's filling your head with nonsense, Betty," he said, not looking at me as we walked home. "Talk of foreign ports and fancy cities. That's all it is. Talk. His kind are like seagulls. They land for a moment, make a lot of noise, and then fly away without a backward glance." "He's not like that, Dad," I insisted, a strange new defiance rising in me. "He's different." "They're all different until they're gone," he said, and the finality in his tone ended the conversation. But his words were just noise against the symphony Joe was conducting in my heart. After a week, Joe asked if I would take a walk with him on the pier after my shift. I knew my father wouldn't approve, so I lied, saying I was going to a friend's house to study. The guilt was a small, dull ache compared to the thrilling anticipation that consumed me. That evening was the first of many stolen moments. We'd walk along the docks, the salty wind whipping my hair, the rhythmic clang of halyards against masts our only music. Under the vast, star-dusted sky, Joe would talk about his dreams. He spoke of one day leaving the Navy, of settling down and opening a small bookstore, or perhaps a boat-building shop. He made it sound not like a fantasy, but a plan. And in his plan, he started to include me. "You'd like California, Betty," he'd say, taking my hand. "The sun shines all the time. We could have a little house with a garden, just like you wanted. You could grow anything you wanted there." And I, a girl who had only known the rocky soil of Maine, allowed myself to believe him. I was 16, and his words were seeds falling on fertile ground. I fell in love with the effortless way he moved, the warmth in his voice, the incredible future he painted so vividly. I fell in love not just with him, but with the version of myself that existed in his stories, a woman of the world, a partner in a grand adventure. The 2 weeks passed in a dreamlike haze. On his final night in Port Blossom, he took me to the small, pebbly beach just past the edge of town. The moon traced a shimmering path on the dark, calm water. He stopped and turned to face me, his expression more serious than I had ever seen it. "I have to leave at dawn," he said, his voice quiet. The words were like stones dropping into the peaceful pool of my happiness. "For how long?" I asked, my own voice barely a whisper, thick with tears I refused to shed. 6 months, maybe a little more. We're heading to the Pacific." He saw the look on my face and pulled me closer. "But I'll be back. I promise you, Betty. And when I come back, I want you to come with me. We'll get married. We'll start that life we talked about." It was insane. To leave my father, the diner, the only life I had ever known, for a man I had known for only 14 days. But standing there, wrapped in his arms, with the universe spread out above us and the gentle shushing of the waves at our feet, it felt like the only sane choice in the world. He pulled a small silver locket from his pocket. It was simple and unadorned. "This was my mother's," he said, fastening it around my neck. The cool metal felt like a brand against my skin. "I want you to keep it. It's my promise. A placeholder, until I can give you a real ring." That night, sleep was impossible. I lay in bed, clutching the locket, my mind racing between the terrifying prospect of leaving and the unbearable thought of staying. By the time the first gray light of dawn seeped through my window, I had made my decision. I dressed quickly and ran down to the docks. His ship was already preparing to depart, steam billowing from its stacks. I saw him on the deck scanning the pier. When his eyes found mine, a brilliant smile lit up his face. He came down the gangplank one last time. "You came," he said, his voice full of relief. "I'll wait for you," I said, the words tumbling out. "I'll be here when you get back, and I'll go with you." The joy in his expression washed away any lingering doubt I had. He kissed me, a deep, desperate kiss that tasted of coffee and salt and promises. "I'll write every week," he vowed. 6 months, Betty. Count the days. I stood on that pier long after his ship had become a gray speck on the vast expanse of the ocean. Only then did I walk back to the diner, my hand never leaving the locket at my throat, my heart already a calendar, marking off the days until his return. The first letters arrived just as he had promised, postmarked from exotic-sounding naval bases. They were filled with declarations of love, with vivid descriptions of the places he was seeing, and with repeated assurances of his return. Each letter was a lifeline, a tangible piece of our shared future. I read them over and over until the paper grew soft and the ink began to fade, hiding them in a loose-floored board under my bed. I lived for those letters. The daily rhythm of the diner became a backdrop to the real life unfolding in my imagination. Our house in California, our garden, our bookstore. My father watched me with a sad, knowing look in his eyes. He saw the way I'd rush to meet the mailman each day, the glow on my face when a letter arrived, the quiet disappointment when one didn't. He never said, "I told you so." He just quietly absorbed my joy and my anxiety, his silence a testament to a love that was deeper than any warning. After 3 months, the letters began to change. They grew shorter, the descriptions less vivid, the promises more vague. He was busy, he wrote. The work was demanding. Mail service was unreliable. The excuses were all plausible, and I clung to them, refusing to see the pattern, refusing to acknowledge the growing chill of fear in my heart. Then, the weekly letters became bi-weekly, then one, thin letter, a month. By the 5th month, they stopped altogether. Every day became a torment of waiting. I'd stare out at the harbor, praying to see his ship appear. I started asking other sailors if they had news of his vessel, but no one seemed to know anything. The 6-month mark came and went, then 7 months, 8. The hope that had sustained me began to curdle into a sick, gnawing dread. I imagined the worst, a storm at sea, a terrible accident. The thought of him being gone forever was agonizing, but it was a clean, noble grief. It was somehow more bearable than the alternative, the one my father's words had warned me of, the one I couldn't bring myself to face, that he had simply forgotten me. The truth arrived on a cold, gray afternoon in the dead of winter. It was delivered by the postman's daughter, a girl I'd known since kindergarten, who handed me the airmail envelope with an expression of pity that made my stomach clench. The letter wasn't from Joe. The return address was in Norfolk, Virginia, and the name on it was Mrs. Shirley Parker. My hands trembled so violently I could barely tear the envelope open. The letter inside was written on delicate floral stationery, a cruel contrast to the brutal words it contained. It was short, and its honesty was a blade to the heart. "Dear Miss Miller," it began, "I am sorry to be the one to tell you this, but I feel you have a right to know. Joe is my husband. We have been married for 3 years, and we have a 2-year-old daughter named Gloria. I recently discovered your letters hidden in his sea chest. It appears he has led you to believe he was free to build a life with you. I am sorry to say, this is not the first time he has done something like this. I ask that you please cease all contact and move on with your life, as we are trying to do with ours." The world didn't just stop, it shattered. Every word, every promise, every shared dream collapsed into a pile of pathetic, cruel lies. He hadn't just left me. He had a whole other life. A wife, a child. The locket around my neck, once a symbol of his love, now felt like a hangman's noose. I was a fool, a naive, stupid little girl who had traded her quiet, simple life for a fantasy spun by a liar. That night, I wept until I was empty, a hollowed-out shell of the girl I had been. When the tears finally stopped, a cold, hard resolve took their place. In the pre-dawn darkness, I walked back to the same beach where he had made his promises. Without a moment's hesitation, I ripped the locket from my neck and hurled it into the churning gray waves. I watched the ocean swallow it, taking my foolish dreams down into the cold, dark depths. As I turned to walk home, a sharp, unfamiliar pain seized my abdomen, so intense it buckled my knees. It was a pain I'd been ignoring for weeks, dismissing it as stress, as a symptom of my heartache. But this was different. It was violent, insistent. I barely made it home before collapsing. The next morning, my father insisted on calling the old town doctor. After a brief examination in my bedroom, his face grim, he confirmed the secret my own body had been trying to tell me, a truth I had been too lost in my own fantasy to recognize. I was 4 months pregnant. Pregnant with the child of a married man who lived 1,000 miles away. Pregnant and alone in a small town in the 1950s, where a girl in my condition was not a victim, but a disgrace. The silence I had feared was nothing compared to the storm that was about to break. The doctor's words hung in the air of my small bedroom long after he'd closed the door behind him, heavy and suffocating as the summer fog that sometimes rolled in to choke the harbor. Pregnant. The word was a sentence, a judgment. It echoed in the sudden, frantic drumming of my own heart. I stared at the faded floral wallpaper, the same pattern I'd woken up to every morning of my life, and saw it for what it was, the flimsy boundary of a world that had just been irrevocably condemned. My future, once a simple straight path, had fractured into 1,000 unrecognizable pieces. When I finally summoned the strength to leave my room, I found my father sitting at the kitchen table, his back to me. He wasn't reading the paper or fixing a broken piece of equipment as he usually did in his rare moments of rest. He was just sitting there, his shoulders slumped in a way I'd never seen before, not even in the raw, desolate years after my mother's passing. He was staring at the salt shaker on the table, as if it held the answers to some terrible cosmic question. He had heard. Of course he had heard. In a house this small, secrets had no place to hide. I stood in the doorway, a prisoner awaiting her verdict. I braced myself for the explosion, for the rage his stern silence had always promised. I expected him to yell, to curse my foolishness, to decry the shame I had brought upon our family name in this town where a name was all you had. But the explosion never came. Slowly, he turned his head. His expression wasn't angry. It was something far worse. It was a landscape of pure, unadulterated pain, a deep, weary sorrow that seemed to have aged him a decade in a single afternoon. He looked at me, and for the first time, I didn't see my stern, unyielding father. I saw a man who was terrified, a man whose heart was breaking for his only child. "He did this to you," he said, and his voice was a rough, broken whisper. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, an indictment. The dam of my composure broke. A sob tore from my throat, a raw animal sound of shame and fear. "I'm sorry, Dad," I choked out, the words feeling pathetic and small. "I'm so sorry." He rose from his chair, and for a moment I flinched, an old ingrained fear of a hand that had never once been raised to me, but that I always knew held the strength to. Instead, he walked over and wrapped his arms around me. It was a clumsy, unfamiliar embrace. He was not a man built for comfort, but it was an anchor. His worn flannel shirt smelled of coffee and onions, the scent of my entire childhood, and I buried my face in his shoulder and wept, letting out all the grief and betrayal and terror I had been holding inside. He just stood there, his large, calloused hand patting my back in a slow, awkward rhythm. "It's not your fault," he murmured into my hair, the words feeling like a pardon. He was a liar. "It's not your fault." We stood like that for a long time, two solitary figures clinging to each other as the world we knew dissolved around us. In his quiet, unwavering acceptance, my father gave me the only gift that mattered in that moment. He didn't cast me out. He pulled me closer. He didn't see me as a source of shame. He saw me as his daughter, who was hurt and needed protecting. What I didn't realize then was how far he would be willing to go to protect me, or what that protection would ultimately cost us both. The secret of my condition, however, could not be contained within the four walls of our home. In a town like Port Blossom, privacy was a myth. News, especially of the scandalous variety, traveled faster than a lit fuse. It didn't happen all at once. It was a slow poisoning of the atmosphere around me. It began with the whispers. When I walked to the general store, conversations would halt, replaced by a charged silence that screamed louder than any accusation. Heads would turn, and I could feel the weight of their stares on my back. Then came the looks. From women I had known my whole life, women who had given me candy as a child and praised my schoolwork. Now their faces were masks of pity, contempt, or a morbid curiosity that was somehow the most painful of all. I was no longer Betty, the diner girl. I was a cautionary tale, a Sunday sermon illustration come to life. The mothers who used to smile at me now gathered their own daughters a little closer as I passed, as if my sin were a contagion they might catch from the air. The diner, once my sanctuary, became a stage for my public humiliation. The regulars still came. My father's cooking was too good, and the prices too fair for them to stay away completely. But the easy camaraderie was gone. The air was thick with unspoken judgment. I continued to work, my growing belly hidden for as long as possible under my father's oversized aprons. I moved with my head held high, my face a carefully constructed mask of indifference, but inside, every sideways glance was a paper cut, every whispered comment a fresh stab of shame. One afternoon, a woman named Mrs. Gable, who was the leader of the church sewing circle and the town's self-appointed moral compass, sat at the counter. She had known my mother. She used to pinch my cheeks when I was a little girl. She watched me refill her coffee cup, her eyes narrowed. "It's a tragedy what can happen when a young girl is left without a mother's guidance," she said, her voice just loud enough for the two men in the corner booth to hear. "They lose their way. They forget their virtue." The hot coffee sloshed over the rim of the cup, scalding my hand. I didn't even flinch. The burn was nothing compared to the fire of shame that consumed my face. Before I could even think of a response, my father was there. He came out from the kitchen, a spatula still in his hand, his face like a thundercloud. "My daughter has more virtue in her little finger than you have in your whole gossiping soul, Eleanor," he said, his voice dangerously low. "Pay for your coffee and get out of my diner, and don't come back." The diner went dead silent. Mrs. Gable, her face flushed with indignation, fumbled in her purse, threw some coins on the counter, and stormed out, the bell above the door ringing furiously in her wake. The two men in the corner suddenly found the floor fascinating. My father turned to me, his expression unreadable. "You go rest in the back," he said gruffly. "I'll handle the rest of the shift." His defense of me was a fierce, beautiful thing, but it came at a cost. It drew a line in the sand. From that day on, you were either with us or against us, and we quickly learned that most of the town had chosen to stand with Mrs. Gable. The diner's business slowed. The whispers grew louder. We were becoming islands. Amidst this sea of condemnation, there was one small, solitary lighthouse of decency. His name was Dennis. He was a lobsterman, a few years older than me, quiet and steady as the tides. He'd been a regular at the diner for years, always taking the same stool at the end of the counter, ordering the same lunch special, and reading the day-old paper someone had left behind. He was a man of few words, and in the past, I had barely noticed him. But now, his quiet presence became a lifeline. While others averted their eyes or spoke to me in clipped, disapproving tones, Dennis looked me right in the eye, just as he always had. He never mentioned my condition. He never offered pity. He just talked to me like I was still Betty. "Wind's picking up out there," he might say, nodding towards the window. "Gonna be a rough evening for the boats still out." "You be careful then, Dennis," I'd reply, and the simple, normal exchange felt like a drink of cool water in a desert. One afternoon he came in and set a small burlap sack on the counter. "Had a good catch," he said, not quite meeting my eyes, a hint of a flush on his face. "Thought you and your dad might like a couple of lobsters for dinner, on the house." Tears pricked my eyes. It wasn't about the lobsters. It was about the fact that someone had seen us not as pariahs, but as people worthy of a small kindness. "We can't accept that, Dennis," I stammered. "Not accepting it as a gift," he said gruffly. "Accepting it as a favor to me. My icebox is full, they'll just go to waste." I knew he was lying, but I also knew it was his way of preserving our pride. "Well, in that case, thank you, Dennis," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "Thank you very much." He just gave a short nod, paid for his coffee, and left. That small act of grace gave me a sliver of strength I didn't know I still had. It was a reminder that even in the darkest, most judgmental corners of the world, human goodness could still exist. The months crawled by, each day a new struggle against my changing body and the town's unblinking stare. The winter came, blanketing Port Blossom in a thick layer of snow that seemed to mirror the cold isolation of our lives. My time was near. There was no question of going to the hospital in the next town over. My father wouldn't hear of exposing me to that level of scrutiny. He arranged for the town midwife, an old grim woman with hands like worn leather, to come to the house. The night it began, A fierce nor'easter was blowing in off the Atlantic, rattling the windows and screaming like a banshee. The pain was a blinding, all-consuming force, pulling me under waves of agony and terror. The midwife was efficient and detached, her instructions delivered in a monotone. My father paced the kitchen like a caged animal, his helplessness a tangible presence, even through the closed bedroom door. In the midst of the pain, a strange thought took hold of me. This child, this innocent, was my only connection to Joe. It was the only real thing to come from his lies, and as I fought, a fierce, protective love began to bloom in the barren landscape of my heart. This baby, my baby, would be loved. It would have the constancy and devotion I had been foolish enough to crave from its father. It would be my redemption. I would pour all the love I had into this tiny being, and together we would be enough. This thought became my mantra, the light I focused on as the storm inside me raged in sync with the storm outside. The ordeal lasted through the night and into the gray, stormy dawn. At the very peak of the pain, when I felt I was being torn in two, when I was certain I could not possibly go on, it was over. There was a sudden, shocking stillness, a relief so profound it was dizzying. I lay back, gasping, my body trembling with exhaustion, and I waited. I waited for the cry, the first, lusty, life-affirming cry that I had been promised, that I had been clinging to as my reward for enduring this hell. But the room remained silent, a thick, terrifying silence, broken only by the howling of the wind and the midwife's low muttering. I pushed myself up on my elbows, a primal scream of a question clawing its way up my throat. What is it? Why isn't she crying? The midwife wouldn't look at me. She was working over the small, still form, her movements efficient but lacking the urgency of a life-saving effort. It's a girl, she said, her voice flat, devoid of all emotion. She was gone before she ever got here, child. Sometimes it just happens that way. The world ended. It simply stopped. The wind, the rain, the beating of my own heart. It all faded into a roaring void. Gone. My baby, my redemption. My one beautiful thing born from so much ugliness. She was gone. All that pain, all that shame, all for nothing, for a silence, a cold, empty, permanent silence. I don't remember much of the hours that followed. It's a mercy, I suppose. My mind simply disconnected. I have flashes, like distorted photographs from a nightmare. The midwife wrapping my daughter in a clean white sheet, my father's face, a mask of such utter devastation that it was almost unrecognizable. The midwife leaving a small white bundle on the dresser before quietly letting herself out. A gold coin my father had pressed into her hand, her only payment for her work and her silence. I was floating in an ocean of grief so vast I couldn't even feel myself drowning. At some point, my father came into the room. He sat on the edge of my bed. He didn't speak for a long time. Then he said, his voice a raw, splintered thing, "Betty, we have to protect you." I didn't understand. Protect me from what? The worst had already happened. There was nothing left to fear. No one can know, he continued, his words slow and deliberate, as if he were laying stones for a wall. There will be questions. The authorities, the church, they'll want papers, a burial plot. They will dig into every corner of this. They will put you on display. They will never let you forget. He stood up and went to the dresser. He picked up the small white bundle. He held my daughter for a moment, his large, rough hands surprisingly gentle. "I'll take care of her," he said. "I'll find her a quiet place, a peaceful place, and then this is over. We never speak of it again. To anyone. Ever. Do you understand me, Betty? It never happened." His plan was born of a desperate, misguided love. He thought he was saving me from a lifetime of public shame, from being branded as the mother of an illegitimate child who had died. He thought he was burying the scandal along with my daughter. He didn't understand that he was burying me, too. He was building a prison of silence around me, a prison he would stand guard over for the rest of his life. He was asking me to erase the most significant event of my existence, to pretend my daughter had never been. I was too broken to argue, too lost in my grief to understand the long-term consequences. I just nodded, a single jerky movement. He took that as my consent. He pulled on his heavy coat, took a shovel from the lean-to, and with my daughter held securely in the crook of one arm, he walked out into the dying storm. I watched from my window as his figure disappeared into the gray, swirling snow, on his way to commit an act of love so terrible it would haunt us both until our dying days. The years that followed are a blur in my memory. I went back to work at the diner, a ghost in an apron. The town, seeing that I was no longer pregnant and that no baby had appeared, drew its own conclusions. The whispers changed in nature. Was I lying? Did I get rid of it? The questions were never asked to my face, but they hung in the air, a permanent poisonous smog. I existed, but I did not live. The grief was a constant, physical ache in my chest. Every time I saw a mother with a child, every time I heard a baby cry, the wound would tear open anew. My father and I never spoke of that night. It was a locked room in our shared house, a door we never opened. His act had created a chasm between us, a shared secret so dark it could not be bridged by words. He grew older, more stooped, the weight of what he had done etched into the lines on his face. Life settled into a numb, gray routine. Then, nearly 6 years after that terrible night, another letter arrived. It was in a long, official-looking envelope from a law firm in Norfolk, Virginia. My heart seized in my chest. For 6 years, I had not heard or spoken Joe's name. With trembling fingers, I opened it. It was a dry, formal document. It informed me that their client, Mr. Joseph Parker, had been killed in a naval training exercise accident. My mind registered the words with a strange detachment. He was dead. The man who had started it all was simply gone. But it was the next paragraph that made the air leave my lungs. It stated that in a will he had drafted 5 years prior, he had left a bequest. The sum was small, only $500, but the recipient was named as Miss Betty Miller of Port Blossom, Maine, in gratitude for a past kindness. $500, and a lie, a past kindness. Was that what he called it? Destroying my life, leaving me with a phantom child and a grief that would never end? I felt a sudden, violent surge of rage, an emotion so powerful it momentarily burned through the fog of my sorrow. How dare he? How dare he reach out from the grave with this pittance, this pathetic attempt to clear his conscience? What did it mean? Did his wife, Shirley, know about this? Was this his final, cruel joke? The letter was a stone tossed into the stagnant pool of my life, and the ripples of its impact were just beginning to spread. The lawyer's letter felt heavier than a tombstone in my hand. The paper was crisp and formal, the words typed with an impersonal precision that was a universe away from the passionate, messy scrawl of Joe's love letters. He was dead. The man who had been a ghost in my life for 6 years, a phantom I simultaneously mourned and despised, had become a real ghost now. And this letter, this final bizarre communication from beyond the grave, was not an apology. It was not a confession. It was a transaction. $500 for a past kindness. A wild, hysterical laugh bubbled up in my throat, a sound so alien I barely recognized it as my own. Kindness. Was that what he called the complete and utter demolition of a 16-year-old girl's soul? Was that the price he put on a life that was never lived, on a daughter he never knew, on a grief so profound it had hollowed me out from the inside? For 6 years I had been a vessel of sorrow, numb and silent. But this letter, this final insult, had struck a flint in the darkness. For the first time since that terrible snowy night, I felt something other than pain. I felt rage. It was a clean, hot, purifying fire, and it burned away the fog. I stormed into the kitchen, the letter clutched in my fist. My father was at the sink, peeling potatoes for the evening's chowder, his movements slow and methodical. I slapped the letter down on the wooden cutting board next to him. "He's dead," I said, my voice shaking with the force of my anger. "Joe, he's dead." And he left me this. My father stopped his work. He slowly wiped his hands on his apron and picked up the letter. He read it once, then a second time, his expression hardening into a familiar mask of granite. He looked not at the words, but at the name at the bottom, Joseph Parker. He said the name aloud, his voice dripping with a contempt he had kept bottled up for 6 long years. "Blood money," he spat, crumpling the letter in his large hand. "That's what this is. A coward's attempt to buy his way into heaven. You will not accept this. We will burn it. We will burn it and forget his name forever." "No," I said, the word sharp and defiant. It was the first time I had truly contradicted him since I was a girl. "I'm not going to burn it, and I'm not going to forget. You don't get to tell me to forget, not after what you made me do." The accusation hung in the air between us, heavy and toxic. The locked room, the one we never opened, had just been kicked wide open. His face contorted, a mixture of pain and anger. "What I made you do? I saved you, Betty. I saved you from a lifetime of being pointed at, from being the town charity case, the mother of a bastard child who died in shame. I gave you a chance to have a life again." "A life?" I shot back, the words tearing from me, raw and bloody. "You call this a life? Walking around like a ghost, pretending my daughter never existed? You didn't save me, Dad. You buried me right alongside her. You took my grief and you locked it away because you couldn't bear the shame of it. This isn't about protecting me. This was always about protecting your name, your pride." It was a cruel thing to say, and perhaps not entirely true, but in that moment, I wanted to hurt him. I wanted him to feel a fraction of the silent agony I had lived with every single day. He recoiled as if I had struck him. The anger drained from his face, leaving behind that same wounded, devastated look I had seen the day the doctor confirmed my pregnancy. "That's not true," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Everything I did, it was for you." "Then let me have this," I said, snatching the crumpled letter from his hand. "Let me have this one thing that is mine, this rage. This acknowledgement, as twisted as it is, it's all I have left of him. It's all I have left of her." He didn't have an answer for that. He simply turned back to the sink, his shoulders once again slumped in that posture of defeat I knew so well. The wall of silence between us had been breached, but instead of clearing the air, the confrontation had only added new, more jagged bricks to it. The next day, for the first time in my life, I took the bus to the city, 20 miles down the coast. I walked into the imposing stone bank, a place I had never entered before, and endorsed the check from the law firm. The teller barely glanced at me as she counted out the crisp bills. $500. It felt like a fortune, and at the same time, it felt like nothing. It was the price of a life, and it was an insult. I didn't spend it on clothes or a trip or anything for myself. I knew exactly what I had to do. I found a stonemason's workshop in a dusty part of the city. I described what I wanted: a small, simple block of granite, no bigger than a shoebox, with no name, no dates, just a single small star carved into the top. It was to be a secret marker, a memorial only I would understand. It was for the tiny star that had shone so briefly in my life before being extinguished. When the stone was ready a week later, I smuggled it home. One moonless night, when my father was sound asleep, his heavy breathing filling the small house. I took the stone and a small trowel and walked to the edge of the woods behind the old church. I didn't know the exact spot, of course. He had never told me, and I had been too afraid to ask. But I knew the general area he had disappeared into on that snowy night. I chose a place beneath a tall, ancient pine tree, a place that felt quiet and protected. I dug a small hole, placed the granite marker inside so it was flush with the earth, and covered it with pine needles. There was no ceremony, there were no tears, just a quiet, profound sense of release. I had defied him. I had marked my daughter's existence on the face of the earth. I had reclaimed a piece of my own motherhood, my own grief. It was a secret I would now keep from him, a silent rebellion that gave me the first flicker of strength I had felt in years. Life continued its slow, monotonous march. The diner opened at dawn and closed at dusk. The seasons turned. I was no longer a girl, but a woman in her 20s, my youth having evaporated in a fog of sorrow. The rage the letter had ignited eventually cooled, leaving behind a hard, protective shell. I was polite to the customers, I was a dutiful daughter, but my heart remained a frozen, locked thing. Dennis was the only one who seemed to see the flicker of life that remained. He was a constant. His quiet kindness never wavered. He never pushed, never pried. He simply created a space where I could be, without judgment. Our conversations slowly expanded beyond the weather and the catch of the day. He'd tell me about his boat, the quirks of its engine, the constant battle against the relentless sea. I, in turn, would sometimes share a small detail about a book I was reading. As my father grew older, his energy began to wane. His steps became slower, his hands less steady. It was Dennis who started showing up on his days off to fix a leaky faucet in the diner's kitchen, or to help my father haul in the heavy sacks of potatoes from a supplier. He never asked for payment, waving it off with a gruff, "Neighbors help neighbors." He was slowly, quietly, weaving himself into the fabric of our broken lives. When my father was diagnosed with lung cancer, it felt less like a shock and more like an inevitability. He had carried so much weight for so long, it seemed his body had finally decided to give out. The last few months of his life were spent in the small bedroom of our house, the smell of sickness mingling with the familiar scent of the sea. I nursed him with a strange mix of duty, love, and resentment. We were trapped together with our shared unspoken secret. But as he grew weaker, the walls between us began to crumble. One evening, his breathing was shallow, and I knew his time was short. He motioned for me to come closer, his hand trembling as it reached for mine. "Betty," he rasped, his voice a ghost of what it had been. The pine tree, the big one at the edge of the woods, 10 paces north by the outcropping of rock. Tears streamed down my face. After all these years, he was finally giving me her location. He was giving me back my daughter. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his eyes pleading with me. I thought I was protecting you, keeping you safe. But all I did was make you carry it all alone. All that pain, alone. Can you forgive an old fool for that?" In that moment, all the anger I had held onto for so long simply dissolved. I looked at the frail man in the bed, the man who had committed a terrible act out of a fierce, desperate love, and I saw only my father. "There's nothing to forgive," I said, squeezing his hand. "You did what you thought was best. You stayed with me. That's all that matters." A flicker of peace passed over his face. He held my hand until his grip loosened, and he was gone. His death left a silence in the house that was even more profound than the one I had carried in my heart. I was truly alone now. The diner, the house, the mountain of bills, it was all on my shoulders. I was overwhelmed, drowning in a new kind of grief, layered on top of the old one. It was Dennis who threw me a lifeline. He wasn't just a sympathetic neighbor anymore, he became a partner. He showed up the morning after the funeral and simply started washing dishes. He took over dealing with the gruff, loud-mouthed suppliers I had always been intimidated by. He taught me how to read the complex ledgers my father had kept, showing me where we were losing money, how we could be more efficient. He was there from dawn until long after dusk, a solid, calming presence in the chaos of my life. The town, which had long ago moved on from my youthful scandal, now saw me differently. They saw a woman who had nursed her dying father, who was now fighting to keep his legacy, the diner, afloat. The old pity was replaced by a quiet, grudging respect. People started coming back, filling the empty booths. Dennis and I found a new rhythm, one of easy companionship. We worked side by side, a well-oiled machine. After the last customer had left, we'd often share a pot of coffee at the counter, the silence between us comfortable, not strained. We talked about everything and nothing. We never talked about Joe. We never talked about my past. I felt safe with him. For the first time in over a decade, I felt something akin to peace. I started to believe that maybe, just maybe, a different kind of life was possible. A quiet life, a simple life, with this good, steady man by my side. This fragile new hope had just begun to take root in my heart when Dennis shattered it into a million pieces. It was a late autumn evening, a year after my father's death. We had just finished closing up. The wind was howling outside, a mournful sound that always put me on edge. Dennis seemed unusually quiet, his brow furrowed with a tension I hadn't seen in him before. "Betty," he said, turning to me from his stool at the counter. "There's something I have to tell you, something I should have told you a long, long time ago." My stomach clenched. "What is it, Dennis? You look so serious." He took a deep breath, and he wouldn't meet my eyes. He stared at his own hands, resting on the counter, as if they were the hands of a stranger. "It's about him," he said, his voice low. "It's about Joe." I froze. "What about him?" "I knew," he said, the words barely audible over the wind. "Back then, when he first came to town, I knew what he was." "What are you talking about?" I asked, a cold dread spreading through me. He finally looked up, and his expression was full of a shame so profound it was painful to witness. "Sailors talk, Betty. Fishermen, Navy men, they all end up in the same bars when they're in port. I'd heard his name before he ever set foot in this diner. I'd heard the stories. The men, they bragged about him, called him the Heartbreak Kid. Said he had a wife and kid back in Virginia, said he had a girl in every port from here to Manila. The room started to spin. The friendly, comforting space of the diner suddenly felt like a cage. You knew?" I whispered, the words catching in my throat. "You knew he was married?" He nodded, his misery evident. "I saw how you looked at him. I saw how happy he made you. You had this light in you I'd never seen before. I wanted to tell you. God, I wanted to warn you so many times. But I was a coward. Who was I to break your heart?" I thought. I hoped maybe this time it was different. Maybe you were the one who would make him change. And by the time I knew for sure that he was just playing the same old game, it was too late. He was gone, and you were already broken. He reached a hand out towards me, but I flinched back as if from a hot flame. The man who had been my savior, my steady rock, my one beacon of kindness in a cruel world. He had known. He had watched me walk straight off a cliff and had never said a word. The foundation of trust, so carefully and slowly built over the years, had just been dynamited, and I was left standing in the rubble, once again, utterly and completely alone. The sound of the wind howling outside the diner was a mournful symphony, a perfect accompaniment to the shattering of my world. Dennis's confession hung between us, an invisible, jagged thing. All the air had been sucked out of the room, replaced by the suffocating vacuum of his decade-old silence. The man I had leaned on, the man who had become my anchor in the relentless storm of my life, had just admitted to watching me drown. He saw the change in me. He saw the fragile trust, so painstakingly built, evaporate from my expression, replaced by a cold, desolate emptiness. It wasn't the fiery rage I had unleashed on my father. This was different. This was the quiet, absolute death of an emotion. It was the chilling realization that my judgment, my very instinct about people, was fundamentally broken. I had chosen one liar who broke my heart, and then I had chosen to trust another who had stood by and let it happen. "Betty, please," he said, his voice raw with a desperation that barely registered. "Say something, yell at me, throw something at me. Anything is better than that look." I finally met his gaze, and my own voice, when it came, was flat and brittle as frozen seagrass. "Why?" It was the only question that mattered. Why would you watch me fall so completely for a lie? Why would you let me build my entire world around a fantasy when you knew the truth? "I was a coward," he repeated, the words sounding hollow and inadequate. "I was, but it was more than that. You were so alive. For those 2 weeks, you were happy, truly happy. I'd never seen you like that." The thought of being the one to tear that down, to be the one who wiped that light from your face, I couldn't do it. I told myself it wasn't my business. I told myself maybe I was wrong. Maybe the rumors were just stories. "But you knew they weren't," I stated, the quiet certainty in my voice leaving no room for argument. He sagged, defeated. "No, deep down, I knew they weren't." I felt a profound, bone-deep weariness wash over me. I didn't have the energy for a fight. The battle was already over, and I had lost again. "I want you to leave, Dennis," I said, turning away from him to start wiping down a counter that was already clean. The repetitive, mindless motion was the only thing keeping me upright. "Betty, just for the night. We can talk in the morning." "No," I interrupted, my voice sharp now. "I want you to leave the diner. Don't come back tomorrow. Don't come back at all. I can't look at you. Every time I see you, I'll just see him. I'll see the lie. I'll see the fool you let me be." "Don't do this," he pleaded, his voice cracking. "You can't run this place alone. It's too much." His words, meant to be a plea of concern, struck me as the ultimate insult. It was as if he believed my survival was dependent on him. A new, harder resolve settled in my bones. "I've been alone my entire life, Dennis," I said, finally turning to face him, my expression unyielding. "I was alone when he left, I was alone when my daughter was born, and I was alone when my father died. Your being here, that was the illusion. I'm just waking up to the reality. Now please, get out of my diner." He stood there for a long moment, his face a portrait of anguish. Then, with a slow, heartbroken nod, he turned and walked out, the bell above the door giving a final, mournful chime as it closed behind him. I stood in the empty diner, the silence roaring in my ears, and understood that the last safe harbor I had in the world had just sunk beneath the waves. The weeks that followed were the hardest of my life. Running the diner alone was a Herculean task. I was the first to arrive and the last to leave, my days a relentless blur of cooking, cleaning, ordering, and bookkeeping. The work that 2 and then 3 people had once done now fell entirely on me. Sleep became a luxury, and my meals were whatever I could grab between orders. My father and Dennis had shielded me from the brutal mechanics of the business, the gruff, impatient suppliers, the complex tax forms, the constant threat of a failing refrigerator or a clogged drain. Now I faced it all alone. The business began to suffer. My exhaustion led to mistakes, burnt orders, forgotten coffee refills. The friendly atmosphere that my father had cultivated and that Dennis and I had maintained, was replaced by the tense energy of a woman stretched to her breaking point. The regulars were sympathetic at first, but their patience soon wore thin. The whispers started up again in town, a new chorus to an old song. Couldn't keep the business afloat without a man to run it. Always knew she'd run it into the ground. And what happened to Dennis? Chased him off, I hear. Poor man. Never could catch a break with that one. Each comment was another turn of the screw. I was failing. I was failing the memory of my father, failing the legacy of the diner, and proving everyone's worst assumptions about me to be true. My brief period of quiet respectability was over. I was back to being the town tragedy. I retreated further into myself, my world shrinking once again to the four walls of the diner and the lonely rooms of my house. My only companion was a deep, abiding bitterness. I had been wronged by Joe, by my father's suffocating love, and now by Dennis's cowardly silence. The world, it seemed, was a place designed to break me, over and over again. It was on a bleak, rainy afternoon, nearly a year after Dennis had left, that the next ghost of my past arrived, delivered in a thin, airmail envelope. I saw the Norfolk, Virginia postmark, and my blood ran cold. It had been more than a decade since the lawyer's letter. My first thought was that it was from her, from Shirley. Perhaps she had discovered the details of the will and was writing to unleash a new wave of vitriol, to accuse me of something more. The thought of reading another woman's hatred for me was more than I could bear. I tossed the letter, unopened, onto the cluttered desk in the back office, letting it disappear among the unpaid bills and supplier catalogs. It stayed there for a week, a small ticking bomb in the corner of my consciousness. Every time I went into the office, my eyes were drawn to it. It taunted me with its unanswered questions. Finally, unable to stand the suspense any longer, I ripped it open, bracing myself for the attack. But the handwriting inside was not the elegant, sharp script of a grown woman. It was the rounded, slightly uncertain cursive of a teenager. And the letter did not begin with an accusation. It began with a question. "Dear Miss Miller," it read, "my name is Gloria Parker. I am 19 years old. I believe you knew my father, Joe Parker. I hope this letter doesn't upset you. My mother doesn't know I am writing it. I found your name in a box of his old things, on a piece of paper where he'd written down a list of people who were important to him at different times in his life. Your name was the only one on the list I didn't know." I had to sit down, my legs suddenly weak. Gloria, his daughter. The child whose existence had been a dagger in my heart was now a 15-year-old girl writing to me. I continued to read, my heart pounding. My father died when I was very young, and my mother doesn't like to talk about him much. They were divorced for a long time before he passed. All I really have of him are a few photographs and the stories other sailors tell, but none of them really knew him. I found a packet of old letters in the box, letters you wrote to him a long, long time ago. They were beautiful letters. They made him sound like a good man, a man who could be loved. I know it's a strange thing to ask, and you don't have to answer if you don't want to. But I was wondering if you could tell me about him. What was he like back then? What did you talk about? Anything you could tell me would mean so much. I'm just trying to understand who my father was. Sincerely, Gloria Parker. The letter fell from my trembling hands. This was a cruelty I could never have imagined. An innocent child, a victim of her father's fecklessness, just as I was asking me to paint a portrait of the man who had shattered my life. She was asking me to validate her father's memory, to collude in the myth of the good man he had never been. My first instinct was to tear the letter to shreds and burn the pieces. How dare she? How dare this ghost child of a ghost man ask me to relive the most painful moments of my life for her scrapbook of memories? But as the initial wave of shock and anger subsided, something else surfaced. a strange, aching empathy. She was just a girl, searching for a father she never knew, a girl living with her own kind of silence, her own empty space. She saw him in my letters as a man who could be loved, because for 2 beautiful, stupid weeks, I had loved him with every fiber of my being, and I had poured that naive love onto the page. In a way, I had created the very myth this girl was now clinging to. And in her quest to know her absent father, I saw a faint, heartbreaking echo of my own daughter, Joyce, who had never had the chance to ask any questions at all. For days, I was tormented. I would pick up the letter, read it, and be consumed with anger. Then I would read it again and be filled with a sorrow so profound it felt like I was drowning. To answer would be to lie or to inflict a terrible, truth-telling wound on an innocent. To ignore it felt like a different kind of cruelty, a withholding of a history, however painful, that she had a right to know. I had no one to talk to. My father, with his black and white view of the world, was gone. And Dennis, I had sent him away. The weight of this decision, this impossible choice, was crushing me. I felt the old passivity creeping back in, the desire to just hide, to let the letter be swallowed by time, to do nothing. But the girl's earnest, pleading words wouldn't leave me alone. Finally, one evening, after closing the diner, I couldn't stand it anymore. I walked out of the familiar warmth and into the cold, damp air of the docks. I walked past the shuttered shops and the quiet boats, all the way to the far pier where the lobstermen mended their traps. I found him there, working under the single bare bulb of his shack, his hands moving with a familiar, steady rhythm as he repaired a broken pot. He looked up as I approached, his face a mixture of surprise and caution. He hadn't tried to speak to me in the entire year since I had cast him out. "Betty," he said, his voice quiet. I didn't answer right away. I just stood there, the letter from Gloria clutched in my hand like a talisman. I had come here without a plan, propelled only by a desperate need to not be alone with this particular ghost. I started, my voice failing me. I cleared my throat and tried again. "I need some advice." I held out the letter. He wiped his hands on a rag and took it from me, his brow furrowing in confusion as he read. I watched his face as he processed the words, saw the dawning comprehension, the deep, sorrowful empathy that was so uniquely his. When he finished, he didn't speak for a long time. He just looked out at the dark, shifting water. He didn't offer easy answers or platitudes. He didn't tell me what I should do. "He left a trail of broken things, didn't he?" he said, more to the ocean than to me. "And you're the one who always has to sweep up the pieces." He handed the letter back to me. "I can't tell you what to write, Betty. No one can. But it seems to me this letter isn't really about him anymore. He's gone. This is about 2 people who are still here. It's about a girl who needs a father, and it's about you." His words, so simple and yet so profound, cut through my confusion. He was right. My conflict wasn't with Joe's ghost. It was with myself. It was about whether I would remain a prisoner of the past, defined forever by the wrongs that had been done to me, or whether I could find it in myself to extend a grace to another victim of the story, a grace I myself had so desperately needed and so rarely received. Dennis wasn't trying to fix my problem. He was just sitting with me in the dark, holding a lantern. I looked at him, really looked at him for the first time in a year. I saw the lines of regret that were still etched around his face. I saw the deep, unwavering kindness that had been there all along, a kindness my own pain had blinded me to. My anger at him hadn't vanished, but it no longer felt like a raging fire. It was more like a bed of dying embers. I hadn't forgiven him, not yet, but I understood him. His silence had been born of a flawed human weakness, not of malice. And his support, for all the years that followed, had been born of a genuine, quiet strength. "Thank you, Dennis," I said, the words feeling both strange and right. "For listening." He just nodded. "I'm always here to listen, Betty. You know that." I walked home under a sky that was beginning to fill with stars. I didn't have the answer yet, but I no longer felt utterly alone in the question. The letter from Gloria wasn't a curse from the past. It was a crossroads. I could choose the path of bitter silence, the one my father had chosen for me, the one I had chosen for myself after Dennis's confession. Or I could choose a different path, a harder path, one that required me to speak, to connect, to maybe even begin to heal. I went into my quiet kitchen, the letter in my hand. I filled the kettle and set it on the stove. While the water heated, I took out a single sheet of my best stationery, the box my father had given me years ago for my 16th birthday, a birthday that had taken place just before Joe had sailed into my life. I sat down at the table, the same table where my father had mourned, where I had cried, where I had raged. I took a pen in my hand. The blank page stared back at me, a silent challenge. It was a new chapter, and for the first time, I was the one who would decide how it was written. I dipped the pen in ink, took a deep breath, and began. Dear Gloria. The words hung on the blank page, a bridge to a past I had tried to wall off forever. For a long while, I simply stared at them, my pen hovering. What could I possibly say to this girl? The truth was a weapon, a blunt instrument that would shatter the fragile image she held of her father. A lie felt like a betrayal of my own history, of the silent ghost daughter whose memory I carried every day. But then I thought of Dennis's words. This isn't about him anymore. And I knew what I had to do. I would not give her the whole truth, because it wasn't hers to carry. But I would not give her a complete lie either. I would give her a story. The story of a 16-year-old girl who met a charming sailor who made her feel, for a brief, shining moment, like the center of the universe. I wrote about the diner, about the way the afternoon sun would slant through the windows and catch the dust motes dancing in the air. I wrote about the stories he told of faraway ports, how his voice could make you smell the spices in a foreign market or feel the sun on a different ocean. I wrote about his smile, not what it looked like, but what it did, how it could silence a room and make you feel as if you were sharing a secret with him. I wrote of a young man who was full of dreams and a restless energy, a man who loved the sea more than he could ever love the shore. I gave her the best parts of him, the parts that had been real, at least to me, in the summer of my 16th year. I omitted the promises he broke. I omitted his wife and child. I omitted the silver locket and the agonizing silence that followed his departure. And I omitted the most important thing of all. I never mentioned the child he gave me, the daughter whose life was a single, silent breath. I folded the letter, sealed it, and sent it off into the world, a curated piece of my past offered up as a kindness. It was an act of grace, and in performing it, I felt a strange, unfamiliar lightening in my own soul. A few weeks later, she wrote back. Her letter was full of a touching, youthful gratitude. Thank you, she wrote. You made him real for me. And so began the most unlikely of friendships. Over the next few years, Gloria and I became pen pals. Our letters, at first infrequent, became a steady rhythm in my life. She would tell me about school, about her friends, about her arguments with her mother. I, in turn, shared carefully selected pieces of my own quiet life, the changing seasons in Port Blossom, the challenges of running the diner, the books I was reading. We never spoke of the deeper, darker truths that lay beneath the surface of our connection. We were two solitary women from two different generations, building a delicate bridge across the chasm one man's choices had created. This new connection began to slowly thaw the permafrost around my heart. The act of communicating with Gloria, of revisiting my past in a controlled, narrative way, began to rob it of its monstrous power. It became a story I could tell, instead of a secret that was eating me alive. This subtle shift in me did not go unnoticed by Dennis. After our confrontation on the docks, I had slowly, cautiously let him back into my life. It began with small things. He'd leave a string of fresh fish on my doorstep in the morning. I'd leave a container of his favorite chowder for him at the end of the day. One evening, finding me struggling with a mountain of paperwork, he simply pulled up a stool and began to help, the silence between us companionable rather than strained. We never had one big, dramatic conversation about his past failure. Instead, we had 100 small ones. Over coffee in the quiet of the pre-dawn diner, he would tell me again how sorry he was, and I would finally have the strength to tell him about the depth of the wound, about how his silence had felt like a second, more intimate betrayal. He listened. He never made excuses. He simply absorbed my pain and my anger until it had finally run its course. And in the space that anger left behind, something new began to grow. It wasn't the dizzying, breathless infatuation I had felt for Joe. This was something quieter, deeper, and infinitely more real. It was the love of a man who had seen every broken piece of me and had not turned away. It was a love built not on fantasy and promises, but on shared labor, mutual respect, and a hard-won, honest forgiveness. Dennis and I became partners, in the diner and in life. The loneliness that had been my constant companion for so long began to recede, replaced by the steady, comforting warmth of his presence. Years passed. The diner prospered under our joint care. Gloria graduated from college and began to build her own life. Our letters continued, a constant thread weaving through our separate lives. Then, one spring, a different kind of letter arrived from her. She was getting married, and she had a request. She and her fiancé, along with her mother, Shirley, were planning a trip through New England. She wanted to visit Port Blossom. She wanted to see the place she had read about in my letters. And she wanted, finally, to meet me in person. The letter sent a shockwave of panic through me. Gloria, I was prepared to meet, but Shirley, the woman whose name was synonymous with the single most devastating moment of my life? To face her, after all these years? Dennis found me in the kitchen, the letter trembling in my hand, my face pale. He read it over my shoulder, his arm coming to rest on my back, a solid, reassuring weight. "You don't have to do this, Betty," he said softly. "Yes," I said, a strange certainty rising in me. "I think I do." It felt like the final chapter, the last ghost to be faced. I had spent my entire adult life reacting to the events Joe had set in motion. This time, I would choose to face it, on my own terms, in my own home. The day they arrived, the diner was closed. Dennis and I waited at the house, the air thick with an almost unbearable anticipation. A car I didn't recognize pulled up, and 2 women got out. One was a bright, vibrant young woman who I knew instantly was Gloria. The other was older, a woman whose face was lined with the map of her own difficult life. Shirley. Gloria rushed to me and embraced me as if we were long-lost family, her warmth and enthusiasm instantly dispelling some of the tension. But my focus was on the older woman who hung back, her expression a mixture of apprehension and regret. Later, after a stilted lunch, Gloria and her fiancé went for a walk on the pier at Dennis's suggestion, leaving Shirley and me alone in the small living room. For a long moment, we just looked at each other, 2 women whose lives had been irrevocably and secretly entangled for over 25 years. "I am so sorry," she said finally, her voice quiet but clear. "For that letter I wrote you. There is no excuse for it. I was young, and I was in so much pain. I was hurt and angry at him, and I took it out on you. It was a cruel thing to do, and it has haunted me for years." Her apology, so direct and sincere, disarmed me completely. I was young too, I found myself saying. and foolish. He had a way of making people feel that way, she said with a sad, knowing smile. He wasn't a monster, Betty. He was just a weak man, a man who was always chasing something he could never quite catch. He loved the idea of a family, of a home, but he couldn't bear the reality of it. He loved me, and I believe in his own way, he loved you too. But he loved the horizon more. In her words, I found not an adversary, but an ally. She was not the villain I had imagined for all those years. She was just another woman who had loved a man who was incapable of truly putting down roots. We talked for over an hour, sharing stories, filling in the gaps in our shared history. We were two sides of the same tragic coin, and in that shared understanding, I felt a profound sense of peace settle over me. The old rivalry, the old bitterness, simply dissolved. Before she left, Shirley handed me a small, velvet-wrapped box. "Joe left this for you," she explained. "A few years before he died, he finally told me everything, the whole story, about you, about the baby he suspected you lost. He was consumed with guilt. He said the worst thing he ever did was give you that locket, a symbol of his mother's love, as part of a lie. He spent years searching for one just like it. He wanted to give it to you himself, to ask for your forgiveness. He just never found the courage." With trembling hands, I opened the box. Lying on the velvet was a silver locket, identical to the one I had thrown into the sea in a fit of rage and despair all those years ago. Tears welled in my eyes. It wasn't the same object, but it held the same weight, the same history. But now, its meaning had changed. It was no longer a symbol of a broken promise. It was a symbol of a man's late-life remorse, of a wife's incredible capacity for grace, and of a story that had, at last, come full circle. I had finally been given an apology, not from the charming boy who had lied to me, but from the broken man he had become. And I found, to my surprise, that I could accept it. That visit changed everything. It swept out the last dusty, cobwebbed corners of my resentment, leaving my heart clean and quiet. The life I built with Dennis afterward was one of true contentment. We ran the diner together, a beloved institution in Port Blossom. We grew old together, our love a quiet, steady flame that warmed our small house against the cold Maine winters. He was my partner, my best friend, my peaceful harbor. And Gloria remained a cherished part of my life. She became a daughter to me, in a way, and I a second mother to her. The families that Joe had tried to keep separate had, in the end, found their way together, building something new and beautiful out of the wreckage he had left behind. Now, at 82, I am the one who is alone again. Dennis passed peacefully in his sleep 5 years ago, leaving a space beside me that will never be filled, but his love remains, a comforting presence in the quiet rooms of this house. I look out my window at the same sea that brought me my greatest joy and my deepest sorrow. It has taken so much from me, but it has given me more. It gave me the resilience to withstand the storms, the strength to rebuild after the wreckage, and the wisdom to know that true love isn't about grand promises written on water. It's about the quiet daily choice to show up, to be present, to be kind. It's about the man who brings you lobsters when the whole world has turned its back on you, the man who holds your hand as your father dies, the man who spends a lifetime atoning for a moment of silence. The silver locket rests in a small carved wooden box on my dresser. I don't wear it. I don't need to. Its story is no longer a secret I carry, but a tale of forgiveness that I have finally learned to tell. The silence that once defined my life has been filled with the sound of laughter, of friendship, and of a love that was, in the end, strong enough to hold back the tide. Thank you for listening to me today, for allowing me to share with you this intimate chapter of my life. If my story has touched you, please don't hesitate to leave a like on this video and subscribe to this channel to discover other testimonies like mine. And please share it, because who knows, maybe someone going through a similar trial right now will find the courage to keep searching, to hope, to believe in the impossible. Tell me in the comments, where are you listening from today? Thank you from the bottom of my heart for listening to me.